So, hello everybody. I'm really happy to be here today, and I would like to thank the Royal Ontario Museum for giving me the opportunity to present my research in such a pleasant setting. So today I will talk about Cretan and Terracotta sarcophagi, an example of which you can see in the Royal Ontario Museum. So I will talk about the history and use of these sarcophagi, always in my current research into their production and the craftsmen who made them. So this type of sarcophagi is called a larnax or larnax in the plural. They usually consist of a body and of a lid, and they are made entirely of clay. So larnax were produced and used in Crete during the Bronze Age period, also known as the Minoan period. So here you can see the chronology of this period, which began at the very end of the 4th millennium before Christ and lasted until the very end of the 2nd millennium before Christ. So larnax were burial containers, so they were used to bury the dead. They were used in cemeteries. And this Minoan tradition lasted for a very long time, so for 2600 before Christ, until the end of the period. So of course, the larnax shape has not remained the same for over a millennium. And when they first came into use, larnax were quite small, rectangular or ellipsoidal in shape, and they could be associated with a low convex lid. At the beginning of the late Bronze Age, larnax tended to be more rounded, more circular. They could be also associated with a low circular convex lid, but rectangular shapes continued to be used. And finally, during the second half of the 2nd millennium BC, two specific shapes were produced and used on Crete. So first, the chest-shaped larnax, of which you have the example of the Royal Ontario Museum. So this larnax usually consists of a rectangular body with 4 or 6 legs, and is associated with a pyramidal lid with straight side. But you can also have specimens that have a pyramidal lid, but with more convex side, like this one on the left. So the second shape that appeared during this period of time is called the bathtub-shaped larnax, so in the form of the bathtub. And this type of larnax has an ellipsoidal body which gradually widens from bottom to top, and is never almost found with a lid. Moreover, these two shapes are generally richly decorated with painted motifs. So I will talk a little more about the context in which larnax were used. So larnax were mainly used in collective tombs, so that is to say, tombs in which several deceased persons were buried continuously, sometimes for centuries. So what is puzzling is that larnax were not the only method of burial in these tombs. They were often associated with other burial methods, such as, for example, burial directly on the ground, on the floor, such as this collective tomb in the Sissi cemetery that you see on the left side. Or they could be associated with burial in other clay containers, such as jar, as in this collective tomb in the Fourny cemetery that you can see on your left. Yeah. So it could be said that the use of larnax was intended to individualize the dead from the other deceased person in the tombs, but not really. In fact, and this is particularly true of the early use of larnax, larnax could be used for multiple burials, so for several deceased. It could be reused several times for successive inhumation. And we also have cases of larnax being used as ossuaries, so to contain the specific bones of several deceased people, for example, skulls. So this picture changed a little bit during the last part of the period, so at the end of the late Bronze Age. Firstly, this period saw an increase in larnax use and production. So they were used in almost all cemeteries on the islands and almost everywhere on the island. So from these two maps, you can see the difference in larnax hues between the early and middle Bronze Age and the end of the late Bronze Age. Furthermore, for this period, we have several examples of larnax being used to bury a single deceased person. So, for example, in the cemetery at Moklos, in the northeast part of Crete, several tombs yielded only one larnax which contained only one body, only one deceased person. Finally, with regard to the distribution of the shapes, so of chest-shaped larnax and bathtub-shaped larnax at the end of the late Bronze Age, we can see that the second shapes of the bathtub larnax seems to have been more popular in the east part of Crete. So this suggests that there were regional trends in the use of larnax at the end of the late Bronze Age, regional trend regarding the shapes. So following this contextualization of larnax use, I will now talk about my current research into larnax production techniques and organization. So the goal of such a study is to understand how larnax were made, so what techniques were used to build them, as well as to provide data on the craftsmen and on the organization of the craft space, or we might also say workshop. So my analysis focuses on late Bronze Age larnax, so namely chest-shaped and bathtub-shaped larnax, but today I will be focusing on the chest-shaped larnax because this is a shape you will be able to admire in the Royal Ontario Museum. So to give answer to this question, I use two main approaches. So first, I carry out technological studies on archaeological specimens. So that is to say, I try to observe and interpret the attributes, the traces visible in ancient larnax in order to reconstruct the technique used, so to reconstruct the production sequence. So these attributes can be, for example, fractures that appear on the surface of larnax, or variation in wall thickness, or even cracks that appear in the internal section of the wall, so with a specific orientation of organization. So this technological analysis was applied on 65 larnax from different cemeteries across all Crete. And it enabled me to propose hypotheses regarding the techniques used to build them. So the second approach I used was to reproduce a larnax myself in order to test this hypothesis from the technological study. So I chose to reproduce a chest-shaped larnax, so the same shape as the one in the Royal Ontario Museum, in order to see first if it was physically possible to use the techniques I analyzed from the technological study, and secondly, to be able to compare the traces, the attributes, so on the experimental larnax with those on the archaeological specimen. So this experimental reproduction was carried out in collaboration with Cretan potters from the village of Margaritas. So this village is located in the west part of Crete, and this is one of the last pottery villages on Crete. So potters in this village know, for example, how to collect and prepare the clay, how to shape it, and how to fire it in traditional wood kilns. So the aim of reproducing a larnax was to take into account all the stages in the manufacturing process. So from collecting the clay, prepare the clay, to firing the larnax. So I will briefly outline the different stages we followed. So first, we acquired and processed the clay. So we collected local clay from the village and prepared them by crushing them, by sieving them, and by mixing them together and kneaded them by trampling. Then the larnax was built. So from the bottom to the top by adding successive level of paste. So I will come back in more detail later on the techniques. Then the lid was built directly onto the larnax. So shaping the larnax took around 1 week. And unfortunately, the lid did not stand up to the bad weather and humidity and collapsed, and we didn't have time to make another one. But, you know, this is experimentation. It's happened sometimes. So the next stage was to decorate our body, our larnax. So first by applying a white slip on the surface made from white clay, and then by applying painted motif on the slips. So we had really little information about the decorative tools that could have been used by the Minoan craftsmen. So we tried out different kinds of tools. For example, a paintbrush made from sheep wool, a rolled up piece of cloth, or a feather. And finally, the larnax was fired in a wood kiln. And as it seemed impossible to lift the larnax and transport it and place it in Georgel-Debedde, the potter, so the potter's usual kiln, we had no choice but to build a new kiln directly around the larnax. So this is how the kiln was conceived. So with a stocking channel leading through a simple opening to an upper firing chamber built directly around the larnax. So the firing lasted around 8 hours, and we reached the final temperature of 850 degrees Celsius. And then, once the experimental larnax had been manufactured, it was time to study it. And to do this, I had to break it in several parts, which was a very heartbreaking moment, actually. So I am now going to present my preliminary results on the technique used to build chest-shaped larnaces. So for most of the chest-shaped larnaces I analyzed, I was able to identify the use of coil building to build the body. So this technique involved building the wall from the bottom to top using successive levels of coils. So first, the coils are laid side by side to form a level. Then the level is joined to the previous one. And then the coils are deformed or flattened by scraping them or pressing them between the ends. And this is how the body gradually rises with these successive levels of coils. So the coil building technique leaves many attributes on larnaces, which I was able to compare with those on the experimental larnax. So I'll give you a few non-exhaustive examples of the traces. So for example, cracks in the internal section of the wall, showing the joints between coil level and also showing the height of these coils. So this can tell us whether the coil has been more or less deformed to make them taller. So here, for example, is the internal section of a larnax where the coils have been slightly deformed, so they retain a fairly circular shape. And here, on the contrary, it's the example of a larnax where the coils have been really flattened to reach a height of 5 to 6 centimeters. So these techniques also leaves horizontal breaks that appear on a larnax, also showing the level between coils, or step-like breaks, with each step following the superimposed levels of coils. So to complete the coil building technique, the walls are usually scraped with the finger or with the art tool in order to even out the surface and conceal the joints between the coils. So this technique will leave striation on the surface, the orientation of which indicate how scraping was applied. So for most of the leads I studied, a similar technique also involving coil building has been identified. So the leads were also built from the bottom to top with level of coils, but placed inward. And when the potter reached the top, he sealed it with lumps of clay, pieces of clay. So it is likely that the leads were erected directly on the body after it dried, so that their dimension could match perfectly with those of the body. And for certain leads with convex sides, it is still difficult to understand how they were built using only coil building technique, and it's impossible that some kind of mold or support was used in addition to obtain that nice rounded shape. So to complete this result of technique, we should also mention the technical constraints in larnax manufacture. So firstly, as very large vessels are involved, it is necessary to allow for several partial drying during the building of the wall. So that is to say, to allow the wall to dry a little and consolidate before adding the next level. And when adding the next level, the potter can use a specific method to ensure a good connection with the next one. So for example, he can incise the joint surface with a blade or adding wet clay on the surface to act as a mortar. So it is interesting to note that these partial drying are perfectly visible on archaeological larnaces, as they usually leave long horizontal breaks. And when you can see the internal section of these breaks, you can realize that the Minoan craftsmen use similar incision techniques to ensure a good connection between coils levels. So the second technical constraint I am going to talk about is specifically linked to the shaping of thread-shaped larnaces. So how to succeed in obtaining walls that have a flat and regular topography from bottom to top. So this isn't easy, and not all Minoan craftsmen succeeded. Here, by way of example, are two chest-shaped larnaces that have a very irregular external topography that can be compared with two other specimens that have really beautiful flat walls and regular dimension from the bottom to top. So to understand this difference, I hypothesize that some kind of external support could have been used while building the wall. And this is a technique we tested during the experimental reproduction with the result of a beautiful, flat, regular topography on our experimental larnax. So the use of a support could therefore explain why some chest-shaped larnaces have a more regular profile than others. However, I cannot be entirely sure that such a technique was used because it left no specific traces on the experimental larnax. So what I can say by way of concluding remarks on techniques is that the same general manufacturing process using coil building for body and lids seem to have been used for all the chest-shaped larnaces I studied, whether they come from different regions in Crete or date from different periods in the late Bronze Age. So this suggests the existence of a common, of a shared technical tradition among craftsmen in larnax production, and that the producer formed a culturally homogeneous group. However, within this general technical tradition, there are a few minor variations that I am currently trying to understand. So, for example, whether or not the coils are deformed while joining, or whether or not an external support could have been used during manufacture. So this could indicate technical choices, maybe indicated the existence of several workshops in larnax manufacture. What I also want to show is that there is specific know-how invested in larnax production. This craft activity requires specific techniques and skills to manage, for example, partial drying during a shaping, or to succeed in obtaining a good and regular topography while building this kind of object. So in the last few minutes available to me, I'd like to say a few words about the organization of the craftsmen and of the craft space. So as far as larnax production is concerned, there are two main questions. First, where were the larnax workshop and how was the craft space organized? And secondly, how were larnax distributed from this workshop to the cemeteries? So the problem is that larnax workshops have never been identified in the archaeological Minoan record, so that we have no idea what a space dedicated to larnax production might have looked like and where it might have been located. So the experimental reproduction of a chest-shaped larnax provided an opportunity to address these issues by highlighting the space, facilities, equipment, and tools required to make a larnax. So it showed that the manufacture could take place in an outdoor space, not necessarily connected to a building, that little space was actually required, as most of the work takes place in the immediate surrounding of the larnax, and finally that the manufacturer requires very few facilities that are generally non-permanent. So these specific features of the craft space are reflected in the few ethnographic studies carried out on the production of very large vessels, such as jars, in Crete and Cyprus during the 20th centuries. What is interesting is that these studies also highlight the mobility of the craftsmen who were subject to the weight constraint of their products. So, for example, the Cretan potter of Trapsano, a village in Crete, left their village during the 3 summer months to produce and sell jars in other regions of Crete. So the workshop was then set up in a field near a settlement and only consisted of a kiln and of a shelter that could be built on site. And the kiln and the shelter were then abandoned at the end of the production period. So these experimental and ethnographic data allow us to propose an hypothetical model for the organization of larnax workshops. So the craftsmen, subject to the same weight constraint, could have been mobile, working in non-permanent workshop, perhaps set up near certain settlements and cemeteries. Little equipment and few facilities were needed, probably just a kiln that could be built on site. So in such a model, it is likely that this workshop would have left very few archaeological remains. And for the Minoan period, one case of kiln foundation associated with larnax fragment has been reported. And interestingly, these kiln foundations were located near the cemetery of Armeni, one of the largest late Bronze Age cemetery where a lot of larnax were used for centuries. However, this remained an isolated case and has not been studied in more detail, which is a real pity as it is for the moment the closest thing we have to evidence for the existence of a potential larnax workshop. So thank you very much for your attention. I will end my presentation here and I will be happy to answer any question you may have. Thank you very much.